Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters. When you think of reproductive rights, the fight over abortion in the United States looms large. But what about the rest of the world? What rights do women have globally? How much do they vary? And are things getting better or worse? And to what extent is the debate in the US having an effect on the rest of the world? Joung-Ah Ghedini-Williams is the chief spokeswoman for the Center for Reproductive Rights, an NGO that fights to give women the fundamental right to determine their own reproductive rights. She joins us now. Hello and welcome, Joung-Ah.
Good morning, Nick. Nice to see you.
Yeah, great to see you. Thanks so much for being with us. I've known you for some time, but haven't seen you for ages, so it's really good to be seeing you here, at least on the screen. We're going to talk about what your work is and the subject I've just introduced, but just tell us a bit about yourself. You used to work with the UNHCR. You've spent a huge amount of time in some of the most sensitive and difficult parts of the world over 2 decades. So just tell us briefly about your own career.
Yes, so I started in the humanitarian refugee space in 1994, working in the Bosnian conflict. And that was pretty much the beginning of the rest of my career. So I started with an NGO, and I thought that I would be moving eventually into the human rights space, but arriving in Tuzla in Bosnia, the day after the enclave of Srebrenica fell, I was there to witness firsthand the brutality of what war and conflict, ethnic cleansing looked like. And I kind of knew at that moment that I wanted to dedicate my career to working in this space, and particularly working with women and children, because as you know, it was in every war zone and conflict, it's the women and children of the population that are disproportionately affected. And so from there, I went on to work for the UN Refugee Agency and was there for about 28 years. And then just this July, it feels like much longer, just this July, I made the move to the Center for Reproductive Rights. Reproductive rights are an area that I've always felt very strongly about. And one of the reasons is that, particularly in crisis zones, women and girls are having such difficulty and challenges in accessing everything from maternal health care to education about reproductive rights. For me, it's a health issue and it's an education issue. And reproductive rights really are fundamental human rights, even though in many places, in many countries, in many forums, they are politicized to seem as though it's not. It really is a fundamental human right issue. And we're seeing it around the world. And we're seeing the impact of when, to put it bluntly, when a few men in a room are making decisions that affect women's autonomy, women's access to healthcare, girls' education about their body and their choices that are available to them. So I can't say that I won't go back into the refugee space, but at this time, I really felt like this was an area that I wanted to bring all of the expertise that I had over the last 30 years or so into this space and see what I could do to help with the advocacy and with the communications around repro rights.
Okay, well, we're going to talk a bit later about the situation in the US and what kind of impact that's having on the rest of the world. But I think it's a great idea just to give us a global overview of what's going on. And I'm going to share a screen here, which is actually the center's website. And this is a very useful page here. It's literally a map, and it's an interactive map that anyone can look up. And you can actually go and pick on any of these countries to see what rights women have in any of these particular countries. But I'm going to scroll through. It gives a varied picture, but also perhaps a positive picture, I think, Joung-Ah. It's yes. Yeah, here we have, well, you summarized a huge list of countries here that have actually liberalized their abortion laws. So if I
Exactly.
just scroll through here and just skip the photos here, this is the only. I mean, I would have thought it would be much worse than this. The only four countries, the centre says here, have rolled back the legality of abortions. We know about the US. I think many of us know about Poland. I didn't know about Nicaragua and El Salvador.
Yeah, and we're hoping there is this movement across Latin America called the Green Wave, and we're hoping that El Salvador and Nicaragua will be positively impacted by what's happened in other countries. So Argentina, Colombia, Mexico have all decriminalized, and they've liberalized their laws. In fact, Mexico just last month in their Supreme Court decided that to fully decriminalize, saying that it was against their constitution. We are pretty confident that the same will happen in Brazil before the end of the year. So we're hoping that this green wave that's sweeping Latin America will also spread to El Salvador and Nicaragua, and maybe put a little pressure on the U.S. to the north.
Okay, I think there are three. We'll scroll through some of this quite quickly, but you have 60% of where abortion is broadly legal, but then you've got the three categories I think you have of the situation of people's access to abortion, and here is the green is the sort of no restrictions whatsoever, light blue, yellow, and red, and then dark red where it's completely banned. But I'll just scroll. We'll go through this quite quickly, but I find this quite useful.
Yeah, exactly. So this is where, so for example, Canada is one of the few countries where it's abortion is completely decriminalized at any point. And I think this is, if you look, of course, you have the Scandinavian countries, much of Europe, a lot of the countries where we've seen liberalization across or, progressive policies towards a lot of the social justice issues as well as health issues.
I'll just scroll down, and this is the UK, interestingly, in sort of light blue. There, I was slightly surprised by that. I thought we were comparatively liberal, but maybe it takes into account Northern Ireland, that's a bit more conservative than the rest of the UK.
Yeah, and what's been interesting is that in some cases, like in the cases of some of the Latin American countries, and particularly Mexico, we were very surprised because they're very traditionally conservative Catholic countries. And so you are seeing a difference across the different categories of green, blue, yellow, and reds. Some countries that are outliers, some that are to be expected in the category that they're in.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just whip through this. I mean, anyone can access to this, and we'll share the link with people as well. So I'll stop sharing from there. Beyond countries' legal systems, which gives you the official framework to work in, can you talk about, I suppose, situations where women are going to be far more vulnerable and they're not going to have access to these rights, whatever the legal situation is? And I suppose I'm thinking of people particularly in a sort of refugee environment, a crisis environment, but also obviously extreme poverty as well.
Exactly. So traditionally, historically, those women and girls that are in marginalized communities are always going to have a disproportionate risk and challenges to accessing reproductive rights in general. So that's everything from education, sex education in schools, all the way up to maternal health and abortion services as adults. What we saw at the start of the Ukraine crisis, and at that time I was still with UNHCR, and in fact I was in the region as the Ukrainian refugees were flooding across into Poland and Hungary and other countries. And what we saw was that 90% of those refugees, about 6 million of them, were women and girls. And what we noticed was that because some of the host countries were doing the most that they can in terms of receiving them, giving shelter, giving assistance, but they weren't having full access to healthcare. And that included, of course, reproductive healthcare. And so we had incidents of women who were going back into Ukraine. This is, I mean, fully war-torn, going back into conflict zones, going into Dnipro, going into Kiev, to access neonatal and any kind of maternal or reproductive health care. So if you can imagine, the choice that you have to make is you took the heartbreaking decision to leave Ukraine because of your safety, but you can't get the health care that you need during your pregnancy or after your pregnancy. So you're going back into war-torn Ukraine to try to access this health care. And we published a report on this with some findings, but what I also noticed was that this context happens in so many other conflict zones. So we saw this with many Syrian women who went across into Lebanon, Jordan, and other places where they were only accessing some degree of social health and economic support. And so this is a phenomenon that we've seen in so many other refugee and displacement situations. But on top of that, there are other places, like with the conflict in Ethiopia, where you have such a high level of sexual and gender-based violence, where rape and other forms of sexual assault are weaponized, and you're getting a huge number of women who are victims. And also in places like the Darien Gap in Latin America, where I was there as well last year, and the doctors that I was speaking to said that it was about between 85 to 92% of the women that they were screening in medical sites in the border areas of the Darien were either raped or sexually assaulted. So you have a whole layering. And then, of course, in those countries, so for example, if you look at the maternal mortality rates, of the top 10 countries with the highest levels of maternal deaths, it is those conflict zones. It is the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's the South Sudans. It's the Syrias. And that's, of course, because the infrastructure is destroyed, but it's also because of the basic access. You know, women in positions where they do not feel empowered enough to go and seek the healthcare or to speak up because of the political or social context. So it's a very nuanced and layered situation.
Joung-Ah, I'm trying to figure this out in my own head. Gender-based violence, the use of rape as a weapon in war, nothing new, but increasing awareness of it. I would certainly say since the mid-90s, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe that's just because that's when I was more aware of it. But in terms of, I'm trying to understand whether you're saying that there's lack of awareness in terms of access to reproductive rights, written bluntly, access to abortion in those situations, or is it lack of provision because it's an issue that people already knew about?
I'd say it's both, and there's also a third factor. So it's lack of awareness in that it is one of these taboo areas that we know is happening. And that there's still discomfort or a little bit of reluctance in addressing openly.
And who are you talking about here? Because I mean, you've got extensive experience of UN agencies and also, you know, NGOs working in these environments. So what
I'd say it's not the agencies, it's the governments. So either the host governments, it's also the donor governments. I mean, there are many donor governments who will fund health services, but who will not fund reproductive health services, particularly abortion. There are some that will, particularly in cases of rape or other forms of assault, but some just put a categoric ban on it. The other issue is, of course, the cultural context. So it is very taboo. Many of these communities that we're talking about, they don't even want to acknowledge that the rapes happened. So they certainly don't want to go and have to ask for reproductive health care or abortions. And then I think the other issue is that a lot of displacement or crisis areas, people are constantly on the move. So what we're providing as humanitarian workers is very, it's that first level of response healthcare. And the hope is that once people get to where they're going to settle a bit or they're able to go back, they'll get the kind of longer term healthcare. But a lot of women are not going to feel comfortable or will not want to actually stay and get the kind of reproductive or therapeutic healthcare that they need after cases of gender-based violence or rape. And so I think it puts us in a quandary where you're trying to triage essentially. And of course, we're not even touching on the mental health impacts of these type of violence and the impact that it has on the entire communities around them.
Yeah, okay. That's the humanitarian side, that's the sort of crisis side. But if we were looking at that map, we were talking about countries and sort of institutional protections. If we were to look at that for a moment, can you give us examples of how those, that axis is upheld? If and I'm trying to think of, essentially, and you're saying that the criminalizing of abortion has been receding. The idea that you go and get an abortion, whether it's the healthcare provider or the person who's seeking it, increasingly they're not being prosecuted for it. But what you found is in many countries that's actually not the case. The law actually is not being upheld.
I think that's a perfect way of putting it. I think the other issue is that you may have federal laws, but some of the different states or districts, provinces may not be implementing the way that they're supposed to be. The other issue is that if you're in a community where it is socially unaccepted, it's whether due to religion or membership in a different social group, then even if that possibility is there, you're going to be discouraged or prevented from accessing that kind of healthcare. I know that there was a case, for example, in Poland during the Ukraine crisis, but this is in times of conflict or not, where a woman, a Ukrainian refugee, did try to access an abortion, and it was related to a pregnancy that resulted from the result of rape, and it was her doctor, her Polish doctor, that was then prosecuted. We ended up, with others being able to get those charges dropped. But this is happening not only in times of conflict, but also we're currently arguing cases in countries all around the world where physicians, parents, and the patients themselves are being prosecuted for even trying to access, not even getting the abortion, but even trying to access the abortion care that they.
And this can be a very long struggle. I know you've got a couple of examples in East Africa, Kenya, and also Tanzania. Could you tell us about the Kenyan case, which I gather took 5 years to fight against?
Yes, and we just this year, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, were able to get the mother and the physician that were prosecuted in this case acquitted. So what happened was there was a 16-year-old Kenyan girl who was raped, and she sought medical attention, not for an abortion even, but because she had pregnancy complications. So she sought medical attention, and what one of the results of the diagnosis were that her own health was in threat because of the complications. And while she was being seen by the doctor with her mother in the room, because she's underage, the police came in and arrested all three of them. And then the prosecutors were really pressuring the 16-year-old girl to testify against her own mother and her doctor for trying to access this abortion.
But what's Kenyan law on this?
Well, the Kenyan law was that it's in this case particularly that unless again, unless there was imminent threat to her own health, that it would not really be justified. And I think, again, it's because of the way that the law is interpreted state to state. And so I think what we were able to do with this case was to show that actually this should be standardized across Kenya, because there is a federal law in cases of this issue. I think the important work that the Center for Reproductive Rights does.
Sorry, just to interrupt you there, but the point was that the federal law, Kenyan federal law, actually gave the doctor, or actually covered the doctor and the family. They did have the right, generally, to have access to abortion, and particularly when it might be a threat to the mother as well.
And this happens in many places where, you know, what we're excited about. For example, in Mexico last month in September, same thing. There now is a federal law. What we're worried about is how are different states going to interpret the law? Because you can have a federal law, but if it's not interpreted and implemented the same way across states, you're going to have chaos, as is the situation in the US these days. But I think it's this shift that we're seeing where we have to make it not taboo to talk about these issues. We have to try to find a way that's culturally appropriate and respectful, but also that talks about the basic core of human rights, of accessing healthcare, and of having gender equity so that women and girls are able to make the decisions about their own healthcare. And this really is about healthcare in this case. And I think that, you know, it's this, there is such stigma, not only around abortion, but around reproductive health overall, even in some places where we would think that it wouldn't be the case, because there's such progressive approaches towards other areas.
Right. Okay. I do want to get questions from other people. I know many people are very interested, so please do put your questions in the Q&A box here, which is probably at the bottom of your screen there. I want to do two things, Joung-Ah, and that's one, talk about what impact the debate in the US is having globally. That's the first thing. And then I want to go on to talk about what you're doing in the United States as well. So that first question, the debate is incredibly polarized in the States. Is that message having an impact internationally, or is it something that people are not, it doesn't sort of spill over in any way?
No, it definitely is having a huge impact. And what we're seeing is it's not just linked to reproductive rights. They're almost grouping together some of the messaging around, for example, LGBTIQ plus rights as well as repro rights. And they're using the rhetoric that's been really developed and pushed in the US space in other areas. We're seeing it in Africa. We're seeing it in parts of Western Europe, where we do have very progressive policies right now, but you're seeing this resurgence of conservative right governments or groups, political groups, that are using almost word for word the kind of dogmatic, policy diction, like this, the choice of words that's being used in Western Europe right now are things that we're seeing that are being pulled almost verbatim from the U.S. Debate.
So it's a useful and effective tool they can sort of see on the shelf and they can just grab to use in their own environment. So can you give us some examples? Where's that popping up?
Well, it's popping up across, I mean, we've seen the same language in Germany. We've seen it, of course, in Poland before the elections that just took place. We're seeing it in Spain. We're seeing it in Italy. And we're even seeing it, for example, in some of the Nordic and Scandinavian countries, which have some of the most progressive policies. But we've seen the rise of rightist.
So I find that really shocking. There's a sort of very liberal environment, strong social democratic tradition, and you wouldn't have thought that the abortion debate would have much traction, but you're saying it is. So how so?
And this is, for me, this is where it gets very dangerous, because it doesn't even have to be something that is widely accepted. But if the voices are loud enough and they're disruptive enough, the potential for disinformation and misinformation, as we've seen in the past few years, is huge. And so if you have a minority that is very effective at the tools that they're using across advocacy, communications, and disruption, that can have enough of a ripple effect where you're having people that are really starting to question, oh, is this the right policy? Is this harmful? Is this? And I think that's also part of what we're seeing in the U.S. We know that in the U.S., the majority of people still actually favor abortion. We have the results of different polls to show that it's between 60 to almost 70%. And yet we have in government this almost sweeping across the Republican Party is anti-abortion and anti-reproductive rights. And so they're not reflecting the views and the strong-held beliefs of their own constituency. And so what I'm worried about is that you'll have similar politics across Western Europe, across other parts of the world. And in Africa, what we saw in East Africa, over the summer when we saw the passing of the bill in Uganda that was so strong against transgender and LGBTQI people, you see the same rhetoric, and that it's quite documented that whole group that were able to fund the advocacy campaign that happened, though there are very strong links to U.S. Christian organizations because they're spreading the word. And what we're worried about is that will next transfer into reproductive health care. And then, right now in the US, I think the anti-abortion movement are actually going beyond the abortion issue and trying to start tackling contraception, which has been seen as something that's a given. But I think we're starting to see that the anti-abortion movement is not only going to stop at the abortion argument, but also to start to really question contraception as
and you just spell that out for me? Does that mean that you can no longer have access to the pill, and how are they expressing it, and in what way would they want it?
So it's, as everyone knows, the anti-abortion movement is really framing this as irrespective of whether or not there are medical conditions for the women, they're not considering. They're considering life. They're saying that these are children, unborn children, and so now what we're seeing is from the very far side of the anti-abortion movement. Now they're saying that contraception. There was even a case recently where embryos that were stored in an assisted fertility clinic, they are considering these as children, and so you're possibly endangering the lives of children, and they're saying that contraception is similar. So it's getting quite complicated.
Okay, we've got some questions coming through. So in a second, I'll take a question from Marty Ryan. Marty, if you're there anyway, go ahead, ask your question, Marty. Just say where you are as well.
Yes, I'm in the U.S. I'm in Connecticut, which has recently passed into its state laws the right to abortion. But women have historically been second-class citizens worldwide, and this anti-abortion movement, again, seems to me to be just another example of the power that men have over women. And I would just be interested in your comment about why is this threat, as I see it, rearing its head today?
Big question.
I mean, honestly, I feel that those small group of men that have traditionally held power are feeling even more of a threat. They're seeing that movements of those marginalized communities, and I mean, that includes women and girls, it includes people of color, it includes those in rural areas, it includes those of lower economic brackets, lower education. They're feeling the threat of that. And I do feel that I agree with you, Marty, 100%, that it's, what we're seeing are small groups of men. If we look at the total ban on abortion and reproductive health care that has happened in Texas and 14 states in the US that fully prosecute and criminalize abortion care, even if women's health, the mother's health, the pregnant person's health is in threat. So we recently argued the case of what started as 8 women in Texas now is up to 24. All of these women, Amanda Zarowski, who was the first plaintiff that we were able to argue for, she was pregnant. She with a pregnancy that she very much wanted. She had tried IVF for 6 years, gotten pregnant, and at 18 weeks, the pregnancy, she realized it was not viable, and that the doctors even said, your health is very much in threat because your susceptibility to septic infection is so high. But Roe had just been overturned, and her doctor said exactly a year ago, I could have helped you and given you the abortion that you needed as life-saving medical care. But now I have to wait. I cannot do it until you basically are dying. So that's exactly what happened. She went into septic shock. Her heart stopped twice, and that's when they were able to give her the infection. And unfortunately, because it was so dramatic, and she had so much scar tissue, now her fertility is impacted and she may never be able to have children. And she testified at a hearing at the state Senate at the U.S. Senate, and specifically looked at her state senators and said, I almost died on your watch, and now you say that you're pro-life. There's nothing pro-life about this. Now I don't even have the chance to have my own children. And so this is a very dramatic example of what's happening in the US, where it should be up to the woman and her family, her faith, her physician that are deciding what is the decision she needs to make. But instead, it's happening by a state Supreme Court or, these small group of government officials. The government do not have any say in any other what other medical condition do you need government approval to make a decision about? It is unthinkable. So what we're seeing in the US, unfortunately, I do worry that we might see in other countries around the world.
I want to mention a couple of other cases. One is Adkins versus the state of Ohio that echoes some of the things you talked about in the Texas case. So do look at the center's website if you want to look at that. That's Adkins versus the state of Ohio. The other case I was looking at was the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine versus the FDA. And this surrounds the withdrawal of mifepristone, which is the abortion drug used by, I think, 5 million people in the US to date, and 22 years of use, legalized by 96 countries worldwide. So it's the go-to drug for abortion. But essentially the anti-abortion lobby within the US has had this drug withdrawn. Can you tell us more about that and what's the situation with it?
Yes, so we are fighting the FDA on this case because this is a drug that was approved by the FDA, has been used, has had no issues, was accepted. We know that 1 in 4 women are going to have an abortion in the US, and that number won't change. It's not going to change depending on laws and rulings. What is going to happen is that you're going to have more unsafe abortions that will lead to tremendous impact, both in terms of physical health, but mental health as well. So we are fighting together with, pharmaceutical companies are on our side, physicians are on our side. I mean, it is very clear that this is a case that should never have been brought up. It was brought up in a state, in Texas again, where they thought that they would have favorable court judges. And it will likely go to the Supreme Court. And it is unthinkable also. I mean, one of the things...
What's your hunch there? I mean, I know you're not a lawyer, nor am I, but the argument about rescinding Roe versus Wade was not on the merits of the actual case within itself. It was actually that this should not be a federal issue, that this should be decided at the state level, and it should not be for federal courts to intervene on this basis. Yet here we have a federal case in which they're saying this drug should not be used. So for me, that's slightly confusing.
It is confusing for a lot of us, honestly. And I think that, we haven't seen a precedent like that for any other medication that has been approved and used widely without problem for over 20 years. I think this is the crux of it. They're trying to set a precedent because it's linked to abortion and not because of the veracity or the safety of the medication itself, which would be the only reason that an FDA-approved drug would be taken off the market otherwise. So the bottom line is, if it does go to the Supreme Court, when it does go to the Supreme Court, it will be on the justices. I think also...
So what's the current situation with that case? It went to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit.
Yes.
Can you tell us just a bit about that?
Well, I think that, this is the issue. I think nobody wants to rule on this case. They understand that it is the basis for which it was filed were not really valid. They weren't valid, but they were filed nonetheless because of a favorable court in Texas. So I think what's happening is that, especially now that these huge pharmaceutical companies, that entire alliances of physicians are also advocating on behalf of the right to keep medication abortion. I think that this is where the Supreme Court is going to have a very high pressure situation, because obviously Supreme Court justices are nominated and put on the court by administrations that are in power, and several of the justices that are there were nominated and put on by the Trump administration. And so what you're seeing, this also is very much linked to congressional representation. So, we do have a Republican majority, and I think we have the presidential elections coming up next year. I will say, so the pressure is on. The pressure is on the Supreme Court justices. But what I will say is that in all of the midterm elections and where we've had ballots, and Marty mentioned, Connecticut instating into state constitution, but wherever we've had ballots, state ballots with abortion access or abortion rights, they have shown the support of U.S. citizens for the right to abortion, even Michigan. So I think that what we have now is a situation where you have Supreme Court justices that were put into place by President Trump when he was in power, but you have an overwhelming majority of U.S. citizens who do not want medication abortion to be illegal, who want access to this. And there's no medical finding that would say otherwise as well.
Just to reinforce your point, I want to go back a step. For those who are not familiar with the US system, can you talk about those issues being put on the ballot? We've talked about Michigan, Connecticut, Arizona, I think surprisingly, and then Ohio, another fairly conservative state that has a ballot this autumn. So just say what that means and what they've been doing.
Yes. So, whenever there are the U.S. electoral system is quite a difficult one to explain or make sense of sometimes. But these ballots are basically when you have issue-specific areas of policy that are put in for change. So, for example, with what Marty noted in Connecticut, with what happened in Michigan, they're put into state constitutions. So you have the federal law and you also have the state level law. And what these are specific to state constitutions and to state policies. So when Roe versus Wade was defeated, when it was overturned, what you had was the Dobbs decision, which was the name of the case, was that they have now made it the responsibility of each state to determine what the abortion policy will be. And so in states where there is this polemic of will abortion access be allowed or not, and as you know, there are very fluid borders between states. So you may have one state that fully criminalizes abortion and the one right next to it allows abortion. And so you have these situations where state policies are going to determine whether or not a woman is able to access abortion. These state ballots can be for just about any legal issue that needs more clarification at the state level.
So just to put it to the voters, if there are enough voters, they can bring together and actually table a possible change to the law. And then during that election time, that measure is put on the ballot. And if it gets sufficient numbers of votes, it can pass.
Precisely. And what we've seen is even in those states that are very conservative and that have voted in conservative government, they've still supported abortion access. And we know for a fact from polls both during and outside of elections that the majority of the US public do believe in abortion. And so the other important thing about these ballot measures is that we have finally seen very clear conversations using the language that we want to see. So people are talking about abortion and they're talking about it as the critical life-saving healthcare that it is. It is also about women's bodily autonomy and about being able to make choices for themselves above everything. But for so many women, it is a medical decision. And what some states are doing is denying critical health care. And so what we need to do is to talk about both issues. We have to talk about bodily autonomy and having decision-making power over yourself, about gender equality. What do men ever have to be determined by state law or federal law, whether or not they get, a medical procedure? No, they do not. So this really is about equity issues. It's about autonomy issues, but it is also a healthcare issue. So in one of the other cases that we filed just last month, again, in Idaho, there is an entire alliance of physicians who have become one of our co-advocates in this case, because in the state of Idaho, there were 5 specialized OBGYNs who could perform not only abortions, but
OBGYN stands for?
Obstetrics and gynecology. So those doctors that are supporting women ahead of, during, and after pregnancies. And so they not only performed abortions, but they were the only 5 physicians, the only 5 surgeons in the state who could provide very complicated neonatal and also natal healthcare and surgeries. Because of the laws that have taken place in Idaho, 2 of the 5 have left the state to go practice in other states. Another is about to retire, which means that there will only be 2 within the entire state that will be able to provide life-saving surgery in specific cases. One of the doctors that we had as one of our plaintiffs in this case against Idaho said, this is not just about abortion. This has created a desert of medical health care within the state that will take generations to rectify. So and we also know, because we've seen a poll of medical students who've said they do not want to have residencies and they will not practice in states that ban abortion. That's 14 states. It is creating a healthcare and physician glitch in 14 states across the US. And then, of course, as you mentioned at the top of our discussion, those people that have even greater difficulty, people in rural areas, people who do not have the economic safety to travel. I mean, we had one plaintiff from Tennessee who is a single mother and who had a medical complication. She wanted to have the baby, but she had a medical complication that threatened her health. She had to travel to a state that would allow her to have an abortion to save her own life. She had to find childcare for her children. She had to pay the $800 to find a flight to go to a state. She had to cover the work that she was missing. These are the kind, and then on top of it, she had to have this deeply traumatic experience on her own in a state where she knew no one else. She didn't have her own doctors. I mean, this is the kind, it's frankly, it's barbaric what's happening. And it shouldn't be a case of law. It should be a case of what women are choosing for themselves with their families.
It's deeply shocking. I am, on the one hand, I'm shocked at the idea that this language could be borrowed and that politicians could begin to exercise and bring this into countries where this debate hasn't existed before. You talk about Scandinavian countries. I see the Conservative Party in Britain borrowing ideas. For example, the restriction on, we've had new restrictions on voting IDs. You know, voter fraud is not an issue here, and yet the Conservative Party seems to be borrowing the same language and introducing some of the same rules. And I just can't imagine that they would do the same thing when it comes to abortion. But who knows? I think we've got a question coming up from Hazel Slavin, and then I'll put another question in a second. Hazel, if you're there, do you want to open your microphone and put your question to Joung-Ah? Maybe not. Hazel? No, perhaps not. Joung-Ah, just to go back to this question, the thing that makes me slightly more positive is that anecdotally, I'm aware of more conservative families where they've got children of voting age. All those students, that's the one issue that they're campaigning. They've gone from being, more concerned about field sports and having a good time at university to, when it comes around to election time, making very, very sure at the local level and national level that they are voting for, access to women's health care, basically the right to have abortion, basically trying to get back towards Roe versus Wade. It's one rallying cry for any woman over 18.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, what I hope is that we go beyond what Roe did, because I think that we really do need to decriminalize it fully and really make sure that states are protecting the rights of women and girls and other people that can get pregnant in the US. I think the landscape for social justice and for activism has changed so much. I mean, who would have imagined the kind of movements that we've seen, the groundswells that we've seen around climate change, around racial justice, around LGBTIQ rights? And I think that reproductive rights is the one that should be, and it's not just a woman's issue. It's very much, we have fought, it's a very much a women's equality issue. We fought for generations to get women's rights to be equal to men. So of course that's the crux of it, but it's also, it deeply impacts society. And, I do think that the importance of having men's voices, of them being allies, true and veritable allies about gender equity, about equity overall, about autonomy, is critical at this point. And I think this is where we really do need to be able to come together with other social justice movements and have this as a concerted effort about rights and equity and justice. That's essentially what it boils down to.
Let me come in then with a more critical question, and that's from Audrey Wolfe. Go ahead, Audrey. You have to, I think you just closed your microphone, Audrey. Just open it, click that button again, click it again. There you go.
Hear me now?
Yep, go on.
Well, I'm asking, how worried are you about the elevation of Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House of Representatives? Do you believe he could lead the Republicans toward even stricter laws against abortion in the more liberal states? He has spoken shockingly of increasing the workforce, which means women have to bear children in order to help our workforce, which is pretty outrageous.
It's all a bit like the handmaiden's tale, isn't it?
Yes.
No, it's absolutely true. I think we're very deeply concerned. We know his voting record, not only his voting record, but the role that he had in some of the worst policy decisions and the rhetoric. He's even equated abortion as similar to the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. Like he goes beyond conservatism. And I do think that he is deeply concerning, also because he is relatively, he's unknown compared to other congressmen and other Republicans in general. I think it's very unusual to have a Speaker of the House that is so unknown. Everybody else, there has been traditionally a very clear understanding of who the person was, how they vote on things, and also experience on leadership within Congress. And I think this is one of the issues that we're most concerned about, because we don't know how far he's willing to go. We do know, however, if you look at, and if you just, do a Google search on how he's voted, it's very clear that he is about as conservative as you can get on reproductive rights. And so we do fear that he is going to try to be even more outspoken. What's been really interesting to see is that there are only a few voices within the Republican Party who have said, who've really pointed out the elephant in the room and said, we are going to lose our constituents if we keep being willing to, die on the sword about this abortion issue. And I think that there is a recognition that this is an issue that has the potential to actually destabilize the Republican Party, because there is such support for abortion access.
I guess we do a lot on US politics, Joung-Ah, and I think the question there is, what matters more? It might be a rallying cry for many people who are already Democrats, who might already vote for the Democratic ticket already, and the question is whether or not it actually affects the swing voters. And it on the last election used to talk about suburban women being a critical voter category, and if that's the case, it would indicate that this does matter. I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens in November 2024. Marcy, Ryan, let's just have another sort of follow-up question and thought from you, and then after that, I think we should wrap up. So, Marty, if you're there, go ahead.
Well, I just think it's important to mention that the original Roe v. Wade case was a medical case. It wasn't a women's rights case. There were too many women dying from back alley abortions, and I remember speaking to younger people when I had the chance to say, "You've all grown up with Roe v. Wade. You don't know what it's like when you didn't have it, and you need to protect it." And obviously, that's changed. So I just really wanted to make that comment.
Well, great. Good point. Thank you very much, Marty. Joung-Ah, thank you very much. I think this has been a really good introduction for us. If anyone wants to have more information, do go to the Center for Reproductive Rights website, and it's reproductiverights.org. You can find their map there. You can find various other cases that they've followed around the world, and also you can find links to give them support. Really good introduction. Thank you very much indeed, Joung-Ah. It's been a really good conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Nick. And thank you all who are online and listening and interested. And please do support wherever you are to make sure that we fight the good fight here.